So another type of artist looking for the essence of Englishness, which starts in the interwar period and for some continues after the war, is painting the industrial regions of Britain. And the first such painting you can see is a view of the city of Bolton, the industrial city of Bolton by William Coldstream from 1938. As you can see, it's quite grim and covered with smoke from all the chimneys from the industry. But what I would like you to notice is the next artist. This is one of the amateur artists. He was not a trained painter. He apparently worked as a tax collector all his life until he retired. But he remains one of the favorite artists of 20th century in Britain. His name is L.S. Lowry. He never used the full first name, so L.S. Lowry, and he developed a quite characteristic style, especially of painting human figures. They look like little cartoon characters with kind of stick-like legs, and they look really charming, and they are always presented in the urban environment, industrial urban environment. He worked in the heart of industrial England, so Manchester and the towns around it. So we have the street scene in Pendlebury, which was one of such towns, and many other works. So it shows daily lives of the working people. It shows the poor streets and the factories, but for some reason it struck the chord with the British. So it's not always the beautiful hills and the ancient prehistoric monuments. For some reason, Laurie is one of those favorites. To some extent, he probably fitted the fashion for amateur artists, just as Alfred Wallace did in Cornwall. He was, I would say, probably the Alfred Wallace of Manchester. So this is something to show you that it wasn't all about the beautiful rolling hills and the famous landmarks. But when the war was approaching and Britain entered another world conflict, this was precisely what was used for official propaganda. And here you have 2 out of 4, I think, posters that were made by Frank Newbolt, and they were all equipped with one slogan, with one motto: "Your Britain, fight for it now." And these were posters that were basically displayed in hundreds and perhaps even thousands of copies. They were made into postcards. They were basically displayed everywhere. And the point was, of course, as with any war propaganda, to encourage men to join the army and basically to encourage people to join the war effort. And this cycle has been interpreted many times by art historians as being so effective, and especially the way they use Britishness. So your Britain, what is your Britain? And of course, this is the Britain of the South Downs and the little villages and the little churches and the old oak trees and the one that you have here. One is probably the most famous of the cycle, showing the shepherd with his dog and the sheep walking the area that really looks like the south of England, the South Downs. And the other one showing the village fair on the church green, basically. So we have a church spire and some merry-go-rounds in the foreground. And this was supposed to be your Britain. The remaining posters are very similar. You have an oak tree, you have this kind of rural images. Whereas, of course, the majority of the men that were inspired to join the army by this kind of art were coming from the world of Alice Laurie, from the industrial world, from the world of the industrial cities and factories, and they never even visited the beautiful rural England that was supposed to be your England now. So. But this was extremely effective. So apparently the image that the British people had in their heads of what their country looked like and what they were fighting for was the rural idyll, was the kind of ideal, pre-industrial ideal that that wasn't true anymore, but it was such a powerful vision that it actually inspired people to join the army. I promised you some more works by Paul Nash, and here we have 3 more paintings he did during the war, and you can see that he also became very inspired by aviation, and especially the painting which is entitled Battle of Britain. You have to really look close to notice what's going on, because it looks like an abstract painting, and in fact it is an image of the battle in the air. So you have tiny planes with the exhaust fumes making those kind of abstract shapes in the sky. You have a distant view of land, something that looks like a river, and perhaps the estuary of the river somewhere in the distance. So we have a bit of Britain, but it's the British skies rather than the British land, and we have the battle being fought in the air. And if you look at other war paintings, Second World War paintings by Paul Nash, this is really a trend. So the painting that he called, he gave a German title, Totes Meer, the Dead Sea. It actually looks like a sea of scrap metal, and it's the vision of destroyed German planes somewhere on a heap at night. So there is a moon, and we have something that looks in the moonlight like the waves of the sea, but if you look closer, these are fragments of destroyed German planes. And another one, Death of a Dragon. Of course, a clear allusion to Saint George, the patron saint of Britain, who, according to the legend, fought a dragon, but this time the dragon is again a German plane. lying in the field in England, probably, smoking and dead, apparently. So we have the death of the dragon being the destruction of the enemy plane, perhaps to symbolize the destruction of enemy pride and this kind of German well designs to conquer Britain. Two more works from the war period. One is the painting, or basically a drawing, coal drawing made by David Bomberg. I told you he traveled quite a lot during the interwar period. He wanted to stay in Spain, but then the civil war started there, so he had to return to Britain, and he just arrived in London before the war. So during the Blitz, he was there, and he would document the suffering of London during the German air raids. So what we have here is a very dark work of art, drawing he made in chalk, which is symbolic in its own way. So it shows the dark, destroyed, burnt fragments of the city, with a distant view of St. Paul's Cathedral, looking kind of defiant and proud, which is interesting because Bomberg was Jewish, so he did not really identify so much with the Church of England and Christianity, but still, I guess he used it for its symbolic value. And another work, one of the very famous, very influential paintings of the war period, Coventry Cathedral by John Piper, which shows fragments of destroyed cathedral in Coventry. This was again the city that was destroyed in an air raid by German bombers in the period of the Blitz. This was a beautiful historic city with a beautiful medieval cathedral, which was almost totally bombed out. Actually, after the war, the cathedral was rebuilt, but in such a way as to incorporate the destroyed fragments as a form of a war memorial. But from the very beginning, right after the air raid, people understood that this was something meaningful, something really important, because attacking a historical city. And some say that the Germans actually used Baedeker travel guides to find important places, cultural places, that they then attacked. So it's sometimes called the Baedeker raids. This was, of course, to destroy the morale of the people, but it had a different effect, because people basically mobilized, and they wanted to fight the Germans even more. So that's what you have. The destroyed cathedral, looking almost abstract, looking like a kind of abstract painting. You can see fragments of the Gothic windows, but they are kind of defiant, and the colors are bold, and basically this was used again as a kind of war propaganda for people not to give in, but rather to mobilize their efforts and to fight the Germans. Paul Nash continued after the war. He continued he returned to his favorite subjects, so the hills and the trees, and when he returned to the country home here, and this is what you have, the landscape of the summer solstice from 1943. So he started to paint those mysterious landscapes of the English hills, probably to find peace again in his soul. And the last painting I'd like to show you now in this fragment is the one that Ben Nicholson, one of those St. Ives artists, made when he learned that the war ended. He was an abstract artist before he moved to St. Ives, and there he, like everybody, got inspired by the fishing boats and the trees and the sea and such subjects. So when the war was won, he produced, as you can see, this little quasi-abstract scene of a windowsill with some teacups and boats in the distance, and there is a little Union Jack flag in the corner. This was perhaps as patriotic as he could get, to include this little flag in the corner. So then we'll see what happened after the war. So what happens after the war? Of course, this was a period of national trauma, so you'll have artists trying to deal with this trauma in symbolic ways. There are some important names that perhaps are worth remembering or researching on your own. Definitely two names of the artists that tried to somehow exercise the traumatic experiences of the war. The first artist is Graham Sutherland. He was one of the painters who were inspired by the British landscape in a similar way as Paul Nash was. So they were looking for the mysterious. He was experimenting with some unusual shapes and unusual colors. You can see sometimes elements of the industrial landscape, but mostly the hills and the trees. And when the war started, he continued to paint these kinds of landscapes, but he got quite obsessed with thorny bushes, thorny trees, and if you watch the British Masters documentary, you'll see many examples of the kind of quasi-abstract works he did in the later 40s, showing the thorny hills, the thorny trees and shrubs that look quite dramatic. This all resulted in what is sometimes seen as his most important work, especially of this period, the Crucifixion. He was commissioned to do for a local church, in which he painted the crucified body of Christ in this particularly thorny and dramatic way. Apparently, again, if you watch the documentary, they say that he painted himself. This is a kind of self-portrait, and that he even attached himself to something that looked like a cross. He kind of used the rope to attach himself to this, and he observed his body, the shape of his body in the mirror, so he could sketch the body of Christ. Definitely, this is something that is very dramatic and very dark. And he's by far not the darkest painter that came out of the war, because probably this name would have to go to Francis Bacon. So the artist who was inspired by terror, he was inspired by violence. This was perhaps a streak of his psychology. Some art historians suggest that he had this kind of masochistic streak in his personality. But if you look at the work he does in the 40s, in the 50s especially, there is a lot of religious inspiration, and especially his very famous work called Three Studies for the Figures at the Base of a Crucifixion. So we have again the inspiration with traditional Christian motives, but this is not crucifixion as such, but apparently the figures at the base of a crucifixion, and they are supposed to be monsters. So the figures that you can see are kind of animal or partially human or monstrous creatures, something that you might find in the works of Hieronymus Bosch or Peter Bruegel perhaps. Another version is his own take at the famous portrait of Pope Innocent X by Velázquez, but this time, of course, he reworks it. It's called Study After Velázquez's Portrait of Pope Innocent X, which shows the Pope as a figure of horror, as a kind of screaming man or a ghost or some kind of terrifying apparition, and this has been interpreted as the again shock of the war, the shock of the cruelty that humanity was capable of. So that's probably the legacy of the war that would continue long after it finished. Again, if you're interested, if you'd like to see more about Francis Bacon, there is a documentary just about him called A Brush with Violence, which will give you more about his personality and his love life. And he had a very dramatic situation, because he was really admired in later life, and he went to Paris to receive a very important award and to have a major exhibition. He came there with his lover, the man he was in relationship for a long time, and once when he returned to the hotel, he found his lover dead. He committed suicide. He had some psychological problems, but this was of course a very difficult, a very dramatic moment for Bacon, and he reacted by producing more art, of course, in the way to deal with his grief and to commemorate the man he loved. So yeah, Google that if you want to. But before we finish this part, the last little image by Graham Sutherland of the painting that does not exist anymore, but was very important in the British history of art, namely the portrait of Winston Churchill. This is one of the famous stories of British art, and this was the official portrait of Winston Churchill that was commissioned to mark his 80th birthday by the Houses of Parliament. So they really wanted to make it a big present, so they commissioned one of the best artists of the time, Graham Sutherland, yes, the one from dealing with the thorny trees and the crucifixion and the red landscapes and all that, who would go to Chartwell, and he would spend a lot of time with Churchill, who was an artist and an art lover himself, working on this portrait. So You have the portrait here. I told you it does not exist anymore. Yes, it was probably destroyed by Churchill himself or perhaps his wife, because when it was unveiled ceremonially on a beautiful ceremony to commemorate and thank Churchill for all the things that he did to Britain during the war especially, it turned out he didn't like the painting one bit. He believed this was a kind of mockery, perhaps. It was definitely unflattering, but if you look at it, it really captures the personality of Winston Churchill in later life as a kind of strong, persevering, perhaps a bit stubborn man. It has been likened to an English bulldog, and this is exactly what people thought about Winston Churchill, and he, being an artist and an art lover, perhaps should have appreciated it a bit more. Well, he didn't. He pretended, he tried not to behave in a way as to show how much he didn't like the painting. He took it home, but it was never seen again, and it is presumed that eventually it was burnt either by Churchill or his wife. So we only know the photographs and the studies and that. So we continue in a moment.